Chapter 20 The Blue Stocking. Know him, I'd know his hide if I saw it in the tan yard. Early sang. It was a winter's day, and bitter cold, Sayward thought, for such a poor old man to be out in the wind without a heavy coat. She was upstairs, sewing by the window when she saw him. Now who could he be looking in at the house as he went by? He had on a battered slouch Roram hat and corduroy jacket like an old hunting coat. His leggings were snowy to his knees. Just the same, he held himself mighty straight, like an old poking stick that had been used a long time, worn thin and soon to be thrown on the fire. Hardly had he passed till he turned and tramped slowly back, looking at the house again. Why he was turning in. She couldn't hear his rap from the stairs, but she could his boots stamp off the snow on the back porch. Chauncey and Massey were at their schools, Deasia at the seminary. When Sayward opened the back door, the old man stood there with a drop froze at the end of his nose, his cheeks crossed and crisscrossed with a mess of wrinkles like scrub apples still a-hanging to some wild tree in the snow. Is this Judge Wheeler's place? He wanted to know. Step in the warm, Sayward bid him kindly. At the same time she was thinking, now where did I hear that voice before, and see those eyes running back in his head? Are you his woman? He asked, holding back, and when she nodded, then you must be Sayrd. Don't you know me any more? Sayward stared at him a moment, then she took the broom and swept the snow from his legs and boots. I know you, but I can't name you, she complained. Something in the way he said Sayrd touched off a queer notion in her, and when he came in and stood there in the kitchen with his hat on, a storm of feeling ran over her. It couldn't be. No, it couldn't possibly be. Why, all the old folks thought her father dead this long time. The last they heard, he was skinning wild bulls beyond the Mississippi, and that was 35 years ago. One of those wild bulls Porteous allowed must have killed him. Hardly an Indian would, for Worth had Indian in his blood, and could get along with them if anybody could. Jenny thought that a Spanishman must have cut his throat for his gold. He had sent word how well off he was, but this old bush nipple in her kitchen today didn't look like he ever had a shilling to his name. Is it you, Pap? Sayward asked. I never expected to see you again. You know me now, he called out, pleased. It took you a good while, but I don't blame you. I wouldn't have knowed you from Adam's ox. You're married to the lawyer, they tell me. I knowed him before I went, but I never looked for you to get hitched to him. Take a chair, Pap, Sayward begged him. I'll make you something to warm you up. She remembered how he never drank tea or coffee. Slops, woodsmen used to call them. Liquor was the only drink to stick to a man's guts, they said. Sayward made him a hot toddy, putting in lots of brown sugar, and he sat there, sucking it up from the cup from time to time, with a lusty rattle. Asha stayin' with you. No, she's not here any more. In fact, she's gone nigh as long as you have. We don't know if she's living or dead." Some of the brightness went out of those shiny black buttons at the bottom of his eye pits. "Well, Jenny and Louie are still around. Jenny is. She's married again. Will Beagle's her second man, but Louie's gone. He's the one Asha run off with. We heard he drowned in a river up beyond the English lakes." Worth had set down his trembling toddy cup on his knee. It took him a while to digest this. "Well, Wyatt's all right, ain't he?" he asked. "We hope so," Sayward said carefully. "He always was. Somebody told Jake Tench he saw him in the woods of Michigan Territory, but he never sent word home himself. We thought maybe he would run into you some place out there." Her father shook his head. He sat still a long time. Sayward thought he was thinking of her sister, Sully, wondering had they ever had news of her, but he didn't mention her name. Likely he was afraid to, for Sully was his favorite. "You know you're a grandpappy now, and a great-grandpappy to boot," she said to cheer him up. "I have 9 of my own and 1 dead, and 6 grandchildren a living." But he couldn't get up any sap over his great-grandchildren. They were too distant a relation. He didn't even take much notice of his grandchildren. Once he had a look at them, and they at him. "This is Massey," Sayward said, "and this is Chauncey, the youngest. This is your Grandpap Luckett. Go up and shake hands with him." The two in their teens looked startled. This seedy and feeble old codger, with shaggy white hair, ragged corduroy coat, and breeches worn to the rib, couldn't be their famous grandfather, the great hunter and pioneer they had heard so much about. The first white man in these parts, and the founder of Americus. Why, he didn't look like he could knock over a rabbit, let alone panther and bear. They went up to him reluctantly, but Worth was just as distant with them, dropping their hands like they were small fry out of the river, too scanty to bother with, and had to be thrown back in. He went on talking to Sayward of where he had been and what he was doing the day he got the notion to come back and see his children before he was laid away for good. For all the notice he gave, Chauncey and Massey weren't even there. But when Deasia came in from the seminary, a full-grown young lady, dressed and polite like the gentry, Worth got up to retreat. "Sit down, Pap," Sayward urged him. "No, I got to go," he told her. "Go where? You are staying with us. We got plenty room." "No, I'd be in the way." "You wouldn't any such thing," Sayward protested. "You can have a room all by yourself, on the 2nd floor, so you don't have to climb so much stairs." "I figured I ought to stay with Jenny," he mumbled. "She has no young ones, you say. That might work out better. I'm not used to young ones rippin' and tearin' around." "They won't bother you?" "Oh, they're all right, I expect," Worth allowed. "But all I come for was to see you. Now I have to be going." "Well, you're staying to supper anyways," Sayward said, sternly, like it was all settled. "We can talk the rest over afterward." He threw a sidelong glance through the door to the sparkle of brass and china and claw-footed mahogany in the dining room. "No, I got some things to do," he persisted. "Will Beagle has a boatyard, you say." The girls and Chauncey looked relieved, but Sayward stood there half-provoked. She had lost patience with her own father. She hadn't seen him for 35 years, and now he was running off without his supper. "Well, when are you coming back?" she asked. "Oh, I'll be back sometime to see you. I expect to stay around." "Well, if there's no stopping you, Chauncey can run along and show you where Jenny lives. I hope you tell her how you put me out by not staying." Chauncey put his coat and cap back on, and Sayward went around to the front window to see them go. She hated her father going off like this, but if he wouldn't do a thing, you couldn't make him. She recollected how when her mother used to try, his eyes would get that sunken look. He'd pick up his rifle, and that would be the last they'd see of him for a couple of days. Seldom did Jenny's tongue run faster than the next time she came over. Wasn't Sayward struck in a heap when she saw that old man at the door? Who'd have thought their father still among the living, and the contrary old mule was still like always. He ate his supper with her and Will, but do you reckon he'd stay the night? No, he claimed he slept out all his life, and that wasn't true because he used to sleep in the cabin, didn't he? Anyway, he asked Will if he didn't have a place in the boat-yard he could stay in, and when Will said he had a shanty the men used, Worth had to move right out. He wouldn't even sleep a single night in one of her beds. What would people think, their father coming back like this and living out in an old boat-yard shanty? They'd think he wasn't good enough for his own daughters, and that she and Sayward had turned him out. He run off from us young ones and let us raise ourselves, Jenny complained. He stayed off 35 years. Now that we amount to a little something in this world, he comes back to disgrace us. "I wouldn't say that, Jenny," Sayward said mildly. "He came back ragged and dirty, didn't he? He told who he was in front of the whole town. Why, he never used to look that bad in the woods with nobody to see him. I mind how he used to get you to shave him just to go over to Hugh's trading post in Shawnee Town. We have to recollect he's a mighty old man," Sayward mentioned. "He's not too old to have a woman," Jenny flared. "Barney Grice told Will he knew Pap down in Memphis last fall, but he didn't know he was any relation to us. Barney said Pap had a woman they called Old Profanity. They lived together on the waterfront. Barney doesn't know if she's along up with him here or not, but Sayrd," Jenny's voice rose. "I won't stand for her if she is. The minute he fetches her to the boat-yard, he's got to get out." "Well, that's his business, and I'm not a-going to fret about it," Sayward soothed her. "All we can do for him now is see he gets some decent clothes." "And then he'll never wear them," Jenny said bitterly. "Anything you give him he'll hoard up like a squirrel, lock it up in the old chest Will gave him." "Well, let's give him a chance before we jump on him. Most likely he'll do the right thing. If he won't, we'll have to rig up ways to get around him. For instance, if he won't come up to eat at my place, I'll have to send him something down to his shanty. Supper would suit me best. That's when we have our heavy meal now, on account of Porteous not getting home much at noon. Then I'll have one of the children free to send it down with. but I don't want you complaining. It looks like you don't have enough to feed him." That's the way it was settled. Sayward herself went down to see him whenever she could. It hurt something deep inside of her to come from her fine big house and see her father living in this poor shanty. The door was so low she had to duck her head coming in, his bed a bunk against one side. No more than two could sit in here at one time unless they sat on the bunk. "Why won't you stay with us in the house, Pat?" she asked him, but he never would. One time he told her, "Right where your place stands, I shot the deer with the blue horn. Do you mind that old blue horn? It had a mess of points. Oh, that was a handsome spot them days. I can see it yet with the big butts and creepers, the way God Almighty made it. Why, it was so thick around dar that Buck never seed me. And now all slashed off and gone to rack and ruin. I can't look at it. Only thing left is the river, and that don't look like itself, with the woods killed off, and not near the water coming down that used to." She had to keep after Chauncey. He hated to carry the supper basket. He and Massey hated still worse when their schoolmates asked, "Is your grandfather still living down at the boatyard?" But the older girls said, "Thank God the old man isn't in the house now that Aunt Cornelia is coming." Seldom, if ever, was it grandfather or grandpap. No, it was the octogenarian, or the ancestor, or the old man of the western waters, or Mama's old Indian fighter and painter tracker. Porteous was the one who put them up to it, especially now that his fine blue-stocking sister was coming from the Bay State to visit them in Ohio. The first time Sayward laid eyes on her, she had to admit, to wonder how she and her would get along. Porteous had looked for his sister by boat. That way she couldn't have got to Americus before June. But one day, late in May, Sayward and Deesia were house-cleaning when they saw the stage stop in the square. Almost never would the driver go out of his way, but this time he drew up right in front of their house, and Sayward knew it must be for a good reason. Even before Ned Hanshaw got down from his seat and set a pile of traps on the sidewalk. Then he opened the coach door, and a lady stepped down. Could that be Porteous's sister? Sayward thought. She had always reckoned Cornelia Wheeler like Miss Morrison, tall and sweeping, with a handsome face and gracious manner. Now this was a short, plain woman like Aunt Unity, and with a face like the Pope's. Her bonnet looked plain and old-style enough, her hair drawn down severely on either side, yet the stern way she held herself, the costly look of her ribbed taffeta, and the respectful way Ned Hanshaw treated her told you that this was a great lady, and one more to reckon with than Miss Morrison. Deesia fled upstairs to change her dress, but Sayward went right out as she was in her red dusting turban. You couldn't keep Porteous's sister waiting in the street, with her traps and everybody in the stage and square a-watching. I'm scared. I reckon you're Cornelia, she said, and gave the white fingers in the black mitt a stout shake. You are Porteous's wife. His sister's eyes went over her distant as a Bay State mountain, but Sayward wouldn't explain that they hadn't looked for her yet, and that's why she wasn't better dressed. "Come right in. I'll fetch your traps," she said. "Porteus will be real surprised when he comes home and finds you are here." She spoke friendly, like sisters-in-law should, but already she felt that Cornelia Wheeler looked down on her. Sayward thought she wouldn't mind too much. The only thing Porteus's sister better not look down on was her children, for they had Wheeler blood a-flowing in their veins, the same as their Aunt Cornelia. Not so much, perhaps, but enough to let them stand up and be counted. They having the Wheeler name besides. She needn't have fretted when Deesia came down, all dressed up. Her Aunt Cornelia gave her plenty of notice. "So this is Deesia, of whom I've heard so much," she said in her genteel Bay State voice, and held her cheek to be kissed, which she hadn't to Sayward. Her keen blue Yankee eyes surveyed the girl. "Did your father ever tell you that you look like your grandmother Wheeler, child?" "In everything, I may say, but your hair. Your grandmother Wheeler used to brush her hair 10 to 15 minutes every morning and evening. She was a very resourceful and determined woman. She was determined to have beautiful hair, and she did." That, Sayward found later, was her sister-in-law to a T. She turned her sharp Yankee eyes on every young Wheeler that came around, reminded them who they were, and started to make them over right away. No matter if they were half Luckett and part Indian, and lived way out west here in Ohio, they had to measure up to their family back in the Bay State. She told Massey at once that her name was not Massey, but Messy, that there had been a Messy Hopewell who converted the Indian heathen 150 years ago, and that no young lady of 13 or 14 with Messy Hopewell's name and her blood in her veins would tear into the house like a young savage or a western tornado. Now Chauncey had to straighten his shoulders and turn his toes out. "You favor your great-grandfather, John Eliot," she told him. "He had a brilliant mind. I often heard my mother say he was one of the most fearless speakers in Massachusetts. He would have made his mark if his country hadn't lost him at Bunker Hill." Oh, Huldah called her Lady Washington behind her back, and Libby dubbed her the old family tree. "Your mother tells me your husband is a young physician," she said to Libby. "I want you to bring him over. I'm sure he would be interested to know that your father's cousin, Henry Wheeler, was one of the most skilled and beloved medical practitioners in New England." Sue's eyes watered with pleasure when she heard that she got her musical talent from Sarah Elliott, who once sang for President and Miss John Adams, which was much better than from Aunt Jenny out here in Ohio, and no matter how little Resolve cared that he looked like his great-uncle, General Ezra Norris, he was glad to have a general in his family to set up against Faye's papa. Miss Morrison and the girls looked up to Aunt Cornelia, and listened impressed to her stories about the Norris houses, the Elliott brains, and the Hopewell silver. Now the Wheeler silver wasn't so much, but no family ever did so much for the town of Quinham, near Boston, as the Wheelers. Aunt Cornelia stayed for a month, and even though she hardly raised her hands to do a tap, Sayward wouldn't have minded having her all summer. She was better than a watchdog on the children. If Massey or Chauncey did something outside they shouldn't, she'd tap sharply on the window pane with her finger ring, and when they came in, they better speak the king's English, or she'd set them straight. "It's chest," she would say sternly. "Don't let me hear you say chist again. And it's not bonch. It's not shumac or sassafrac or peppermint or lavaw. Now say them with me. Bene, sumac, sassafras, peppermint, leve, and it's not campfire, it's camphor and camphaw." Sayward felt beholden to her for that, and for telling them about their father's side of the house. Why, till it was over, she her own self knew more about Porteus's folks than her own. She could tell her grandchildren that hadn't been born yet about Hobart, the queer old wheeler coachman, who claimed that one of his horses died coming down the Quenham Hill, but he held him up with the lines till he got to the bottom about Rover. Big black Elliot dog their great-grandfather liked so much that he had its hide tanned when it died and used it as a rug on the floor, and about their great-grand-uncle or cousin Norris, who wore silver shillings for coat buttons, and 11-penny bits for buttons on his waistcoat and breeches. Oh, most everything Cornelia told about Porteus's folks was good. It could be lively or racy or amusing, but it ever made out the Wheelers and Elliot, ladies and gentlemen of high degree. Now why did her father have to come the very last afternoon Cornelia was here, and make the Luckets look like Fly Up the Cricks? Why, all spring and early summer he wouldn't stir his stumps to say words for a meal or visit. He claimed his joints plagued him. Even Jenny herself stayed away during Cornelia's visit, save when specially invited, and then she sat shut-mouthed and uneasy, not wanting to make any slips that would lower her and Sayward's side of the house in front of Porteus's fine sister. One more day, and Cornelia would have been gone back to her Bay State. Then didn't Worth have to come and show himself, looking like an old bush nipple? It was pretty well along in the afternoon. Cornelia had been across the square in the courthouse to see her brother sit on the bench in his robes, and hear her nephew plead the case of a farmer ejected from a place that had been sold. When court adjourned, Porteus came straight home. It being Cornelia's last afternoon, resolve dropped in too. They got in a warm and lively argument, and Sayward felt it was good as court, sitting there in the library a-listening. In another minute, she told herself, she'd have to start supper and get Worth's basket ready, but first she'd listen to Cornelia telling Resolve right out she didn't think much of him taking the case of a man who had no honest right to stay on a place. That's what all the clever and smart lawyers do, she said, take the side against an ejectment because sympathy is on their side. I should think a Wheeler would take the side of justice sometimes. This time the poor and ragged was clearly in the wrong. Just then somebody rapped on the back door, and Massey ran to answer it. Looking up when Massey returned to the hall, Sayward could see her startled face. Sayward rose, and when she got to the kitchen, there was Worth, in breeches, like a pair of feed bags. He had on no coat, only an open buckskin vest, with the hair on it, and under that an old red flannel shirt. White stubble covered his chin and cheeks, yellowed with tobacco juice around the mouth. "Do you want to come in the library, Pappy?" she asked, quiet and steady as she could. "I don't care," he said, meaning he would. Sayward might be bamboozled a little, but not beat out. She hadn't lived 55 years without learning that the old can be mighty shrewd and knowing sometimes, and contrary as a mule. Whatever you don't expect them to do, they are liable to turn up a-doing. Just the same, your father is your father, and the more helpless and childish he is, the more he needs your help, as you needed his when you were little and helpless. Resolve's face was a picture when she brought Worth in the library with his hat on. Chauncey went out one door as his grandpappy came in the other. "I want to make you acquainted with Porteus's sister," Sayward spoke, raising her voice a little so he would surely hear. "Cornelia, this is my father. Will you take a chair, Pappy, and rest yourself?" "I'll have to go directly, but I'll sit down for a lick," he agreed, like he was doing Sayward a favor. His bright old eyes ran from one to another, to everybody save Porteus's sister, and by that Sayward knew he was well aware that she was there, and that's why he came, to get a look at the visitor before she went back home to the Bay State. Porteus leaned back in his chair, and the devil was in his eyes. You could tell he was going to enjoy this, and Sayward didn't thank him for it. "You see before you the original pioneer of Shawnee County, Cornelia," he said in his deep court voice. "Mr. Luckett's the first settler and founder of Americus." His sister sat there on her comfortable chair, not knowing what to make of this ancient critter crouching on the edge of a straight chair, his hat pushed back on his head as a concession to etiquette. Oh, Sayward could have lifted off that hat before letting him in, but hardly would he have forgiven the indignity, and less would she have forgiven herself for trying to make him something he wasn't. What went on now behind Cornelia's stout prim face, Sayward could not tell, save that she was company in her sister-in-law's house, and no matter what he looked like, she would be civil to her sister-in-law's father. "Americus must be very grateful to you, Mr. Luckett," she pronounced. "What for?" Worth asked suspiciously, looking at her direct for almost the first time. "Judge Wheeler just told us, for founding such a growing city in a new land." "I had no idea o' that," Worth told her tartly, "or I'd never settled here." "You are too modest about the good you've done," Cornelia rebuked him mildly. "When you came here there must have been nothing but a formidable wilderness. Today the country is developed, and the people civilized and benefited." "I'd say it's a plumb the other way round," he said flatly. "The country's spoilt, and folks are gettin' less account every day. If you'd have been here 40-50 years ago, you'd know it's gospel. God Almighty made this country the way He wanted, and He never laid any out purtier. He stocked it with game out o' the ark, and told 'em to breed. Why, not far from this place the bucks would come so thick to rub off their horns in the spring, it looked like the deer park I heard my grandpap tell me about. in the old country. You'd run into bear or painters most any place. Mink and fisher fox traveled the runs. I seed squirrels thick in the trees as pigeons. You ever hear a gray moose call, ma'am? That's something to stir up your liver. He's a callin' to his lady love, so they can get together and multiply like the good book says. You wouldn't soon forget it. But this town scum never heard it, and never will. They stick in one place. They go through the whole rumpus of gettin' born and dyin', and have no idee how the Lord Almighty meant them to live. Mighty few ever heard gabby birds a-talkin'. They'd sooner wear them on their hats. The purtiest birds you ever laid eyes on. A kind of poll parrot, not very big. I've seed the trees red and yaller and blue with them. They'd talk to each other like humans. They'd talk to the beaver and otter too, and warn 'em. One time I was watchin' a family of otter. It was up on Crazy Crick, near as I can make out, where a fullin' mill stands now. You can't shoot otter in the water, or they'll sink, and you can't get 'em. But I could a shot these many a time up on them rocks. O' course it was summer, and their skins wasn't much good anyways. But them otter played together like humans. Then they'd sit on the rocks a-watchin' for fish. When they saw one, they'd tell which one had to go in for it. You'd reckon they'd jump in doggy fashion, but they'd peel in that water slick as an eel. Oh, they wouldn't catch a fish every time, 'specially not the young ones. But when they did, they'd fetch it out on the rocks and leave those bones picked clean as a human. That was up on Crazy Crick, and not far from them rocks. I used to keep track of a drone beaver. You know what a drone beaver is. Well, the rest drive him out because he won't work. He'd dug hisself a hole in the bank and lived there all alone. Just cut down enough trees to eat. He didn't have no house and no woman. The rest wouldn't let him. I used to feel kinda sorry for the old varmint, and never shot him, but likely somebody else did. He was an old bachelor, you might say, a poor old hermit. Me and him got mighty friendly, though what happened to him after I pulled out, I can't tell ya. I stayed only so long as it was God's country, but there were no people. Porteus's sister from the Bay State protested. Thank God Almighty, no, Worth said fervently. What would we want with people? What could beef-witted plowmen and dainty town bodies a-done in the woods? They'd a-starved to death. Oh, we wasn't plumb alone. We had friends to visit when we got lonesome. They was some around, scattered here and yonder, white-skinned and red-skinned both. I don't know to this day which was the best. I've been took in by both and given shelter and rations. Once, when I had lung fever and bloody flux, a Delaware woman nursed me kinder than my own woman could. Another time, when I was a small tyke, I played with Injun boys. You know where the Susquehanny is. You crossed it when you come west. Well, right up the west branch, where Deep Crick came in, there used to be a Delaware town. Them was the boys I used to play with. One time I was wrastlin' and fell off a high cliff up the crick. The water hit me purty hard, and I sunk in a deep hole. I knew whar I was all the time, but I couldn't do nothin'. I couldn't move a finger. Once I laid on the bottom, it seemed like I could breathe again, good as anybody. If this was dyin', I told myself, it wasn't so bad. Next thing I knew, I was out on the bank over a log. Them Injun boys had got me out and were runnin' the water out of me. Best friends I ever had. They built a fire and dried my shirt and breeches, and I never had dare tell their mams or paps I fell in, or they'd all got Jessie for near drownin' me. Sayward looked up. She thought she heard the back door open. Jenny stood there. She must have been trailin' Worth. I was just going by, she apologized. "Father, I'm going home. Do you want to go along?" "Where are them good Delaware, Shawnee, and Wyandotte folks now?" Worth went on, paying Jenny no attention, especially that she had called him father. "Killed off and run off. Pushed one place, then another. Now they want to move them over the Mississippi. What for? To give their land to men who hadn't the guts to come out in the first place. That's the kind that mostly got it now. And what do they want with it? Why, they want to make it just like the country they left back east. Already they've put in flour mills, and wool mills, and saw mills, and fullin' mills, and all kind of mills. Any old thing with wheels that water'll turn." He was hollering now. "Money, that's what they're crazy about. Money. A cabin's not good enough any more. They have to have a mansion house like this. A bag of meal used to make a whole family feel good. Now it don't mean nothin'. Folks must live high these days and dress fancy. Make theirselves believe they're more than they are. They can't even tramp with the legs God Almighty gave them, but have to ride theirselves around with hosses and fancy riggin'. At home they sit on their porch stoop or behind their window light and watch folks with nothing more to do than theirselves. Now when we come out, we didn't have no houses. We had nobody pushin' us on a boat or drivin' us packed like chestnuts in a burr. We came on our own legs and totted our plunder on our backs. "Father, it's time to go home," Jenny said sharply. "He's all right here, Jenny," Sayward told her. "I knew a woman done something for money once," Worth went on. "It never brought her any good either. She was one of these fine town bodies back in Pennsylvania. Her man owned 3 farms and a good house and stable in town. They had a smart boy, just a little feller, and his pap took him along one day in front of him on horseback, out to his farm in Nippenose Valley. The Mingos shot him and took the boy. Well, his woman got the house and stable and half the farms, but she wasn't satisfied. She wanted the half that was willed to the boy. When my old colonel got all them Injun prisoners, that woman come to Carlisle lookin' for her boy. He wasn't our. She could easy tell him. He had a birthmark like a berry by the nipple of his right breast. But she wouldn't give up. She wanted the other half of those farms they were holdin' for him. So she took a boy nobody claimed, swore that was her boy, and took him home, though everybody back our knew he wasn't. Well, he grew up ugly and loose. He wasn't satisfied with his share when he got old enough. He went through that and then started on her share. He ran through everything she had. He even ran through her rings and household stuff. I heard she died on charity. The real boy they never did find. You could have told him sure by that mark near the nipple on his right breast. It looked so much like a strawberry you could almost pick it off and eat it, they said. That's how natural it looked. "Pappy, I'm a-goin'," Jenny said, losing patience and forgetting herself. That woman was about the run of folks back east, Worth declared. This was in Pennsylvania, but it could have been in Jersey or the Bay State, where you come from. They're never satisfied. When they come out here, they have to make God's country over, so they make it like the place they left before they come. A man's house out here was open to all that came. He took you in and gave you a bed if he had one to spare. If not, you could make a pallet on the floor. His woman gave you supper when you come and breakfast before you went, if she had any to share with you. Now show me a town body here or back in the Bay State who'll do that for you. The best folks come out here at the start, if they wasn't here already. They was all man and woman, I can tell you. Them that come after or stayed behind were second-raters. They were faint-hearted, weak-legged, or money-grubbing, and it's good they never come early. They couldn't have stood the gaff. They'd a starved or been scared to death. I been around, and I can tell you. I been in the piney woods, where they have runs with the purest water, and yet trees die without nobody knowing why. I been out on the prairies of Iowa, where horses and cattle don't need to be stabled, but feed out all year on grammer and buffalo grass. I been in the mountains and in the Spanish settlements, and I'm a-tellin' you, you're talking too much, Pat. Jenny broke in angrily. Come on home now, and we'll eat. I'll lay a plate for him here, Jenny, Sayward said. It will save me sending his basket down. Worth got up from his chair pretty quick then. No, I got to go. Well, come on, Jenny, if you're a-comin'. Deesia's face was a picture of relief, and Jenny's a foretaste of what she would say to him on the way home. But Porteous's bold features only showed regret that the show was over. As for Sayward, she didn't see why Jenny got so worked up. Cornelia would understand that old men acted mighty strange sometimes. It was their nature. Just the same, it tickled her a little how he jumped on Cornelia and her town folks. She never saw him so stuck up and proud. Why, he carried on like him and his kind were kings of creation, and town folks the ragtag bobtail and small fry. Now who was the blue stocking, she wanted to know, Worth or Cornelia? She wondered another thing. Tomorrow Cornelia's visit would be over. All this time she had been here, and not a word of the trouble that made Porteous leave home and hide out in Ohio. Was it a murder, or was it, as Sayward felt, a woman at the bottom? For 35 years she had hankered to know. It used to torment her what this woman was like, and did Porteous still have a secret wish to go back to her? When she heard that Porteous's sister was coming, she told herself she would find out. Cornelia would tell her, or at least drop some broad hint. Now Cornelia was going without having breathed a word. Sayward knew one thing. Whatever had happened way back yonder, it hadn't set Porteous or the Wheelers up any, and that's why Cornelia kept still. Of course Sayward could come right out and ask her before she went, but she hadn't seen fit to ask Porteous, whom she lived with all these years. Why should she ask his sister she hardly knowed? Now wasn't it strange that it didn't bother her so much any more? Her children, her grandchildren, and herself had got this far without knowing. Whatever it was Porteous had done back there, it couldn't hurt them any more. If it still came to her sought, in some way, let it come. But if it didn't, she reckoned she could go to her grave ignorant and unawares. Chapter 21 Rosa's Cloudberries. And are we not as good as the best now, grandmother? Is everything but circumstances, my child? Ellen Glasgow. Rosa was glad that her mother had 3 friends. The finest was Miss Phillips, who sent the books. She was ever too busy to come herself, and you couldn't expect her to, for she was rich. Her house had a room for only books, and what would Rosa's mother have done without them? Then there was Miss Clocker next door. Virtually never a day passed without Miss Clocker waddling solicitously to the fence and rapping on the Tench window. How did Miss Tench feel today? Well, might she stay to her bed, for this was a cold morning. It looked like rain, on her wash, maybe snow. Her lines were frozen stiff before daylight. Rosa's mother listened, but said little in return, and this together with Miss Clocker's invariable manner toward her established in Rosa's mind the fact that her mother was a definitely higher social position than her neighbor. Miss Clocker never dared to come in either, save one time when Rosa's mother lay on her bed as one dead. But when Rosa's mother opened her eyes and saw her, Miss Clocker hastily beat a retreat. The 3rd friend was Miss Bogardus, and that was she coming up the street now. You could tell her a long ways off. She was housekeeper for old Mr. Millard, who lived on the square. Oh, she was no common housemaid, and when she tramped up Water Street, moving sedately by the slab fence, it seemed that a faded, slightly shabby, but undeniable lady was coming to call on them. How old she was Rosa couldn't guess. She seemed to be made out of some thin, sallow, yet everlasting substance. She had pale blue eyes like the finest porcelain, and brought with her a whole floating cloud of the past. She had known Rosa's mother's family in Philadelphia, and liked to tell about Grandmother Bartram, a real lady of the Quaker faith, and what a pity that she had to die of lung fever before she was 30. Miss Bogardus didn't come in the house either, but came closest to it, calling only in mild weather when she sat on the porch in a chair that Rosa was told to fetch out for her. Here, in plain view of everybody who went by, she visited with Rosa's mother, who sat in the shadows just inside the door, invisible from the street, but everyone knew she was there. Looking at her now, Rosa couldn't say that she liked Miss Bogardus, but she felt pleased and honored when she came, just to see her settled on the porch and hear her thin, positive voice telling of Rosa's mother's family in Philadelphia, of great-aunts, uncles, and cousins, of bonnets and gowns, of house furnishings, and bric-a-brac brought an invisible wave of respectability and peace to the girl, something so substantial she could almost lie on it and let it bear her among the scent of plush and carpets and dyes of the brick Bartram house with white scrubbed marble steps in the city of brotherly love between the Delaware and Schuylkill rivers. Already Rosa had sunk to the edge of the porch, out of reach of her mother's eyes. Here she waited, letting her mind and body subside to that certain relaxed, almost limp state in which Miss Bogardus's words could levitate and transport her. But all the time, while she floated and hovered, a part of her waited for the high point of the visit, when for some mysterious reason Miss Bogardus and her mother invariably wanted her to leave. At last Miss Bogardus turned her head and fixed her pale eyes on the girl. "Rosa, don't you want to run out somewhere and play?" Rosa didn't say anything, just sat there mildly, looking down at her hands, touching her thumb and fingers together one after the other softly. "Rosa," her mother ordered, "go down and see if Miss Doane doesn't have something for you to do." But Rosa kept sitting there in her trance-like repose, and inside of her the anticipation rose. Miss Bogardus was getting ready to tell her mother about the Wheelers. Oh, her mother never asked a word or mentioned the Wheeler name, but she would sit there with such silent decorum and bitter dignity that sooner or later Miss Bogardus always came around to the Wheelers, and nearly always she ran them down. There was something peculiarly vindictive in her tone. She accused, although whom she accused and why, Rosa did not quite know. Her mother listened so pitilessly and cruel. It fixed every word and scene in Rosa's mind, such as the time a summer or two ago when Miss Bogardus talked about Libby Wheeler. Who'd have thought that big lump would ever get married? Why, most people thought she was more man than woman. Her mother could have put breeches on her, and few would have known the difference. Nobody ever saw her do anything but act the fool. She'd play ducks with the boys, and throw rocks with them, tussle with them on the square. I saw her knock boys down more than once. They yelled and carried on. But do you think that woman would come out of her house or even call from the window? That woman, Rosa had long since learned, was Judge Wheeler's wife. Now, would you believe it, Miss Libby's changed. Her breasts are filled out, almost overnight. She doesn't rip and tear any more. What that young doctor from Connecticut sees in her, I don't know, but he started to court her, and pretty quick they were married. Some say they had to get married, but you'd think a doctor would know how to get around that. The last time Miss Bogardus was here, she talked about Miss Holcomb, the oldest Wheeler girl. That Huldah, Miss Bogardus called her. Well, it's true, she told. She and the Iron Master couldn't make a go of it. They're parted for good, and it's all her fault, everybody says. You know how she went out to his place years ago and tried to get him without a stitch of clothes on her shameless body. Then after they were married, she had no use for him. They lived together like fighting cocks. You'd think he'd 'a' made her lie in the bed she made, but he let her have her way, never lifted a hand in court against her. If there'd been children, maybe it would be different, but she wouldn't bear him any. Now she's going with that England man, George Seton. The one that brought in these English sawmills. They say he'll be a lord some day if his older brother ever dies, and that's what she's after. It would make her a lady. Can you imagine that? Common thing, a titled English lady. I thought it would disgust the Iron Master with the Wheelers, but I've lost my respect for him. He still comes to the house, they say, and sits and talks to that woman and asks her advice, just as if she was still his mother-in-law. Miss Bogardus's chief spite seemed directed toward that woman. She told with contempt how Judge Wheeler's wife couldn't read or write until her own children taught her, and even now any school child could read rings around her. You can tell she was never used to anything. She won't have a maid in that big house, but makes the girls help. She raises things in her vacant lots as if she was still on the farm. I don't know where she gets that from, because her father isn't worth a whoop and never was. But to hear her, you'd think he was a saint. She calls him Pappy, and it's Pappy this and Pappy that, and yet she won't have him in the house. He has to stay down in that shanty in Beagle's boatyard, and she sends his supper down in a basket every day, to make people believe she does something for her Pappy. However, it was when Miss Bogardus talked about Judge Wheeler that Rosa felt the strangest, bitterest silence come over her mother. You remember the little Canada man that killed one of the Clarks in Tateville. He's crazy as a loon. That's why they didn't hang him. And dangerous too. You might know if he's a murderer. But Judge Wheeler lets him out a while every day, calls him his messenger, lets him run his errands. Why, he goes all over the city some days, and could kill any of us, but Judge Wheeler claims he's harmless. He lets him go in his own house, and that woman feeds him at the kitchen table. I'm scared of him. If you call him Crazy Bill, he gets mad. He says Johnny Meigs is crazy, but I'm only simple. Can you imagine that? It shows how crazy he is. Of course he sleeps in the jailhouse at night, but he could do a lot of damage in the daytime. It's all Judge Wheeler's doings, and if you ask me, I think he's very high-handed. Mr. Millard's cousin was taking up a collection for that poor woman whose husband was drowned last month. She lives down near the basin. I know all about her. Judge Wheeler stopped him. She's a poor widow with 4 children and takes in washing. I won't give her a cent. What do you mean? Mr. Millard's cousin asked, so surprised. Why won't you help her? Because she's good and virtuous, the judge told him. I never help that kind of person. There's 100 other people that will. I help only the devil's poor. When you're taking up a collection for somebody drunken and worthless that nobody else will give a hand to, come around and I'll contribute. That's exactly what he said. I heard Mr. Millard's cousin say so myself. It's lucky for him that judges are appointed and not elected, or he wouldn't get a vote except from his devil's poor. Now, who would ever think that to see him walking down the street so noble and grand? She spoke as if Rosa's mother went abroad in the city like other people. Rosa sat on the edge of the porch, missing no word. She could see Judge Wheeler in her mind going down the street, and that's how he looked, noble and grand, like Miss Bogardus said. Oh, he looked almost like God Almighty himself, in a high hat and frock coat, his lion's head sunken on his breast, his eyes looking neither to the right nor left. When he passed her, he wouldn't give her a glance. One time, after he went by, a man came up and said something to her. "You're as good as he is," he told her, "and you ought to be living in his house." Now what had this man meant by such a saying? Rosa often wondered, but never for a moment could she dare to ask. One or two loafers must have heard what he said, because that night her father came home, his face black to all save her. He called the boys in and took down his rifle. "I want to tell you young'uns something," he swore. "Rosa is your sister, and this is where she belongs, in this house with me and her ma'am. Anybody that says different, I want you to tell me. I don't care if it's man, woman, or child. I'll fix him so he won't say it again, like I'm going to fix somebody tonight who talked too much." Rosa looked quickly at her mother, but nothing showed on her tired, olive, hawk-like face. Her father went on downtown with his rifle, but they never heard that he shot anybody. The boys thought he might have done it in the dead of night and thrown the body in the river, but Rosa prayed that the man who spoke to her got out of town. That was the first and last time anybody said such a thing to her. Sometimes her brothers would look at her with strange eyes, but that's as far as they went. It didn't mean anything. She told herself that man was likely just a Van Buren man mad at a clay man like Judge Wheeler, but so long as she didn't actually know, she could always hoard the mysterious secret in her breast. Whenever she heard the Wheeler name or saw one of the many Wheelers downtown, a faint, unexplained excitement rose in her, and the man's words came back to her ears. She kept those words in the sheltered shade of her heart. They would shrivel up if she brought them out in the light of day. Today, the magic state was on her like a spell. She could sit on the broken edge of the porch, with the empty stone jugs on one side, and the sack of old rags on the other, with the trash and refuse and junk of the yard in front, and taste the scent and feeling of the Wheeler Mansion house all around her. Miss Bogardus was telling her mother today how Judge Wheeler's fine sister was visiting him now from the Bay State. In her mind, Rosa could see her in her elegant gray taffeta like Miss Doane's sister from Maryland wore, whom Rosa never saw either. But Miss Doane had told her about her sister many times, and how she needn't lift a hand or foot, for she had 100 slaves to do her bidding. Sitting here today, with Miss Bogardus's voice in her ear, and the picture of Judge Wheeler's sister in her mind, Rosa thought, wouldn't it be wonderful if Miss Doane's fine sister, Ellen, came to visit Miss Doane while Judge Wheeler's sister was in Americus? Likely the two knew each other back east, and when they met down on Market Street or High Street, Judge Wheeler's sister would say how glad she was to see her friend out here in Ohio, and wouldn't she come to dinner on Sunday? "I can come, and thank you, but I can't come without my sister," Miss Doane's sister would say. "Then bring her along, by all means," Judge Wheeler's sister would tell her, for she knew that Miss Doane had been the finest milliner in all the state of Maryland before she left. Then of a sudden, on Saturday night, Miss Doane's sister, Ellen, would get sick, and they'd have to have the doctor. "Jenny, I'm a sick woman and can't go to Judge Wheeler's sister's Sunday dinner tomorrow," she would tell. "It's too late to stop it now. You'll have to go and take somebody in my place." "Then I'll have to take Rosa Tench, for she runs all my errands and matches ribbons and threads for me at Meek's Emporium, and she has a good eye," Miss Doane would say. She would say nothing, however, about the rum she sent Rosa for some times. No, not a word would she mention about that, or how she would sit and stir brown sugar in it, and sip it while her face got heavier and her nose got thicker and shorter, till she looked like the Hawk's pug dog sitting on a box. No, all she would do and say, now with her sister Ellen visiting her, was call a catch-a-boy across the street and send for Rosa, and Rosa would hurry down. "Rosa, you are the truest friend I have in Americus," Miss Doane would say. "Will you go to the Wheelers' mansion house to Sunday dinner with me tomorrow?" "But I have no dress, Miss Doane," Rosa would have to tell her. "Then I'll make you one," Miss Doane would say, and she'd sew all night with her sister helping, for Ellen wouldn't be so sick that she couldn't help with the needle, and next day after everybody was home from church she would walk downtown with Miss Doane in her fine dress for Sunday dinner, and everybody would see her, even Miss Bogardus from the Millard windows, and Judge Wheeler's sister would look at her and say, "I am sorry my friend couldn't come, but glad that you are the one Miss Doane brought," and Rosa would sit in the dining room at the mahogany table and eat from china dishes with gold and pink flowers, and put a solid silver fork to her mouth, and across the table Judge Wheeler would have to look at her and say, "Didn't he see her someplace before?" And after dinner she and Massey and Chauncey could go out in the yard. "Rosa," a voice broke suddenly into her daydream. It sounded like her brother Turkey calling from down the street. "Rosa, Miss Doane wants you." It was a shock, as if heaven had suddenly named her. She was wide awake now, but inside she felt shaking. Was it coming true like she had dreamed? She went out of the gate, hurrying a little, a delicious knot in her breast. Down the street she could see the dirty little yellow Doane house, with dirtier and darker doors and window frames. A little crowd was gathered on the vacant lot, aside of the house. She mustn't run, she told herself. If Miss Doane's sister was there, she mustn't see her do anything undignified. Then, as she grew closer, the people on the lot moved so that she could see by them, and her legs didn't try to hurry any more. No, she moaned to herself a little, but she knew it was true. It was the same old story. Between the people she could see Miss Doane's short, stout body lying on the ground. She must have got some money on a bill and was drunk again, lying out in the vacant lot, under the sun, with only her shift on. "Get up, Miss Doane," Miss Gatchell said, poking her. "You're a disgrace, lying out half naked in the daytime. You'll catch the distemper." But Miss Doane lay quiet and peaceful, a small mountain of flesh on the ground, never bothering one plump hand that could trim a hat so deftly lying open on a clump of grass. "Go away," she murmured. "I am in my room, in bed, I am sure. Go out now and shut the door. You're drunk." Miss Gatchel bent down to her. She plucked up a fistful of stones. "Are these what you got in your house on your bed? Look and tell me, Miss Doane." But Miss Doane lay in fine oblivion, letting the world go by, and that, Rosa thought, was proof that Miss Doane was really of high-born stock, for nothing could disconcert or discommode her. "Go out of my house now and close the door, and leave me in peace," she told them. "She's drunk as a sow," Miss Gatchel said to any who would hear. "She'll never listen to you, Rosa." The name stirred life in the sluggish small mountain of flesh on the ground. "Rosa," it moaned, "it's about time you came. Show these rude people out, and lock the door." The girl went up to her quietly. It was curious, but seldom did she feel shy or inferior with Miss Doane. Rather, she felt like a poor but acknowledged relation, and sometimes, as now, like a worthy and equal relation. Even when Miss Doane was sober, at her best, skilfully trimming a bonnet, turning it in her hands to look at it this way and that, telling of the grandeurs of her sister's life in Maryland. She treated Rosa like a special person. With Miss Doane, Rosa's mother, family, and house faded cleanly from her mind, and there was left only good and gentle blood in her veins. Ever Rosa felt free to act and say what she wished when she was with Miss Doane. "They have a right to be here, and I can't make them go, Miss Doane," she said in a low voice. The bleary eyes opened, and back in those round and swollen organs a distorted being regarded her like the misshapen creature that looked out at her from a pug's pop eyes. "Are you going to tell me I'm not in my own house and bed?" she warned. "I wouldn't say that, Miss Doane, but I have to tell you you're not in the right bed. If you get up now, I'll help you back to your right bed, and then all these people can't see you and bother you any more." Grumbling and moaning, and with great difficulty, Miss Doane worked herself up, bearing heavily on the small 13-year-old girl. She had thought all the time she wasn't in her right bed. She said it felt too hard and lumpy. Why didn't somebody tell her? Why did she have to wait all this humiliating while for Rosa to come? She swayed on her feet like a tree with severed roots, pulling the girl this way and that. Her body stank like a whiskey barrel. Her hair had fallen completely down. No stranger, Rosa thought, would ever know her now as the finest milliner in all of Maryland. But through the puffy skin and soiled shift and disheveled hair, Rosa could still see with affection the one whose clever hands were the mistress of any bonnet, and whose sister had 100 slaves to wait on her hand and foot from morn till night, and if need be, again till morning. Where almost there, Miss Doane, she encouraged her several times. The stupefied woman let the girl lead her to the gate, and into the little yellow house, with the dirty yellow doors, and window casings. Chapter 22. Aunt Sully. Blown from night and the north. Sophocles. The last month or two he lived, Worth gave Jenny plenty of trouble. Every time Sayward saw her, she would complain, "He won't wear those new clothes we got for him. No, he holds like grim death to the old. He just does it for spite. He wants to keep me mending and patching, and make it look like we won't keep our own pappy looking decent in front of folks. Then he won't hardly eat what I cook him during the day. Nothing tastes good, he says. But when Will comes home late at night, he sticks his head out of the shanty. "Will, fetch me something to eat," he calls so loud the whole neighborhood can hear. You'd think I half starved him. If it was me, I wouldn't take him out anything. But Will is fool enough to give him what he wants. A month to the day that Porteus's sister went back home, Worth gave up and died. Jenny cried at Sayward's neck when she saw her. You'd reckon Worth had been a wonderful father to her. "I made him such a nice dinner, Sayrd," she said, drawing back and wiping her eyes. "I asked him early this morning what was he hungry for. He answered back like usual, 'Oh, nothing tasted good any more, but you know the way he liked brown flour gravy.' I asked if he wouldn't like some of that. 'Well, that would taste as good as anything,' he said. So I made him some flapjacks to put the gravy over, and some boiled cabbage, and some of that sausage I still have away in lard. He ate pretty good for him. After dinner, I had no idea of anything. He just sat there at the table and flushed up a little. I asked if he didn't want to lay down. He said he didn't care, so he laid down on the settee in the kitchen. I should have knowed from that. Most times he would have no other way than go back to his cabin, but you know how contrary he's been lately. Anyway, he laid down on the settee and crossed his feet, and that's the last I knowed of him for a while. He did give a couple of snores and grunts, but he always did that. They sounded natural except they had a kind of rattle at the end. Miss Heberling was in the front room with me. She could look out through the kitchen door and said, 'I believe your pap's dying.' I looked right away and called Will to run for you and the doctor, but Pap gave up before either of you got here. He died so nice and easy. Look at him. Did you ever see a nicer corpse? You wouldn't think now to look at him. What a trial he's been to us all his life. I can see Wyatt in him for the first time Sayward mentioned. I can see more of Asha, Jenny said, especially round the mouth. The neighbors gone, the sisters closed the door, rolled up their sleeves, and made ready to wash the silent figure and deck him out in the new clothes he'd never consent to wear when alive. Now how long had it been since she and Jenny had done this thing for their mother? It must be close to 40 years. Wasn't it strange that Worth, who never was good for very much, should have been blessed with such long life, and that he should look sweeter in death than he ever had in his lifetime? Well, it's a blessing to go quick, and we ought to be thankful if we're ever that lucky Sayward mentioned. He didn't go that quick, Jenny said. He told me something before he went. I could hardly believe it. Sayward looked sharply at her sister. Jenny went on. It's good I was here. He opened his eyes and saw me standing over him. Then he told me it was about Sully. Sully, Sayward echoed, her own Sully coming first to mind. It was our Sully he meant, Jenny explained. He found her, she's still a-living, out in Indiany. I said, Pap, are you sure? And he said he lived at her house a while. Her name's Harris. She has a good man and is good off, Pap said. He told me the name of the town, and Miss Heberling set it down. I don't know if you can read it. Her hand was trembling so, and I don't know if it would do you any good if you could. Sayward was never so beat out as by what Jenny told her, so their youngest sister was still among the living. Not once all these years had she ever buried Sully in her mind. No, she clung to the thread that some Indians had found her, but hardly had she looked to have word from her after all this time. Even Porteous was stirred up. Indeed, the news that Sully Luckett was still alive, after almost 40 years, shook the Wheeler family, more than Worth's death. Why, ever since they were old enough to be talked to, the children and grandchildren had heard the story of their Aunt Sully, who got lost in the woods. The cows had come home, and their Uncle Wyatt, but never did she. A whole company of men had scoured the deep woods for days. All they found beside Indian signs were teeth marks on a spicewood twig, a red thread on a haw, a few small footprints in a sandy run, and the bower she had made. Oh, the Wheeler children had heard plenty about that bower. Even the grandchildren could tell you what it was like. A little bitty house made from sticks with a bark roof, a block of wood for a table, and a piece from Sully's red dress for a tablecloth. Just to see it, the men could tell a small girl had done this, away back in the trackless wilderness. Far from any human, this little lost tyke had made herself a playhouse to mind herself of her pappy's cabin, and of her sisters and brother she never would see again, or not for 40 years anyway. Worth was buried on Thursday. On Friday, Sayward sat down and wrote a letter to Miss Sully Harris, Vinita, Indiana. If she was her sister, Sully Luckett, lost in the woods and never found, save perhaps by Indians, would she write back and tell her? Their pap was dead and buried now, but his last words told about her. Would she like to know about her brother and sisters? Wyatt and Asha had left home and were never heard from again, but Jenny lived here. Will Beagle was her man. Sayward herself was lawfully married, the mother of 10 children, and 9 of them still living, as far as she knew. Her married name was Wheeler. She did not say her man was a judge. Let her find that out in due course. Deesia could have written the letter in her fine back hand, and saved her mother much labor, but Deesia would want to say everything grand, like in copybooks, and Sayward wanted it like she was, just sitting down with Sully talking to her. The letter filled one side of a fool's cap till it was done, but though she looked anxiously to Chauncey whenever he fetched the mail after that, no answer to her letter ever came. If it's our Sully, why do you reckon she won't answer? Jenny asked her. We let a mighty long time go by ourselves before we wrote her. We can't expect an answer right on the dot, Sayward said, but she looked mighty grave when she said it. Did you ever think, Saird, that Pap might have been a little out of his head before he passed on? It could be, Sayward admitted. On the other hand, Porteous told me about a man up in the Fire Lands who was crazy for 30 years, and just before he died, his mind turned good as yours or mine. I wish I could see my mother, he said, and that was the last thing he did say. I think it's mighty strange Pap never said anything about Sully all that while. Jenny complained. It wouldn't be the first time he acted like that, Sayward reminded her. You ought to know the time we had no idea anybody was living in the woods besides us till just before Martha Covenhoven came a-calling. Then Pap told us and went off hunting, but he knew it all the time. No, this would be just like him as far as that's concerned. It still seems funny to me. Then you got to recollect Sully was a little tyke, the last we knew her. Now we were a good bit older and would mind her better than she could us, but I'd know her anywheres, and if I don't hear anything by the middle of summer, I'm going out. All the way out there, Jenny said. Well, if you're really going, I'm a-going with you. I wouldn't want anything to happen to her or me, and then think I passed up a chance to see our Sully. They made out to go early in August. Sayward said she would take Massey and Chauncey along. She didn't like leaving them back here alone with Desia and Porteous. It would be something for them to see the country and their Aunt Sully. Besides, Will, being in the boat trade, got such low rates, it was cheaper to take them along than leave them behind. They left Americus on a fine morning, with the sun not yet high enough to be hot, and a good-sized bunch of relations and friends down to the basin to see them off. Porteous and Will stood on the wharf holding up their hats, and Little Resolve kept waving till Dyke's warehouse shut them off from view. From the 6th Street Bridge, curious folks looked down on them as they passed under. Jenny wiped her eyes as the city fell behind them. Even Chauncey looked a mite uncertain, but Sayward felt an anxious kind of hope and peace. Oh, she hated going off where she couldn't see all her children and grandchildren for 5 or 6 weeks. But how long had it been since she saw her baby sister? Hardly had there been a rainy night all this time that she hadn't thought of her and wondered what had happened to her that time in the woods so long ago. Could she still be among the living? She used to ask herself, and did she still say such grand spunky things that minded them of their grandmother Powley back along the Conestoga? Do you mind what she said that time we first looked over this country? Sayward asked. I mind, Jenny nodded. We were up on a hill. We could look over 100 miles of country, it seemed like. Woods, nothing but woods it was. I mind it good. She said now, what was it she said, Saird? We mought even get rich and have shoes, Sayward told her. I can still hear how cunning she said it. That seemed like a mighty rash and bold thing to say them days. We couldn't see smoke from a single cabin. I wonder what she's like now, Jenny said. Sayward had been wondering the same, sitting here on the quiet deck of the boat, keeping an eye on Massey and Chauncey that they didn't fall in. She figured that Sully must be going on 50 years. They'd have to remember she'd be changed. Sayward told Jenny. Likely she'd be grander than either one of them, Jenny agreed, with a ring on every finger but one, and 3 on that, for their pap said how she had a good man, and was good off. She might even have a coach, for she was always one to do spunky things. Whether she had any young ones or not, pap didn't say, but if she had, they would likely give Massey and Chauncey a run to keep up with them. They came to Veneta on a Saturday, and Sayward reckoned it the prettiest country she ever saw. The canal ahead looked like it would run head on into a handsome wooden hill, but when they got there they found the water turning against the hill, till a gap opened up where it could go through, and there was the town, with rows of stone and log cabins, some fine white and yellow clapboard houses, and a stone mansion house with a great stone stable, while across the canal and river lay the smooth green banks and meadows of a fine gentleman's farm, with the big house, farmhouse, barn, and outbuildings all painted to match, of pale green, with brown narrow strips, where at regular intervals strips of wood went up and down, closing the cracks. It made a wonderful sight, like some place in old England, and all of them admired it together, with the fat stock grazing in soft fields that hadn't a weed in them. That could be her place, Jenny whispered. You know what pap said. But when they stepped off the boat to the smooth stone work of the basin, an old boatman standing there said, Miss Sully Harris lived on the far side of town. Sayward thought that he and the men hanging around the basin looked at her a little strange. They were shorter spoken, too, than most men on the trip. When she looked back, she saw them all standing where she left them, looking after. Jenny said she guessed they made a sight tramping up the middle of the road, carrying their own traps, 2 women and 2 young ones, all the way from Ohio without a man. She said it looked like a poor way to go visiting a sister who was well off. She thought perhaps they should hire a carriage, but Sayward said it felt good to get their feet on the ground. They had been cooped up on the boat too long, and could tramp a mile or 2 without it hurting them any. There was no house to ask at for a good ways, save a log cabin standing back from the road, a little under the trees. It looked dark from weather. The ground lay tramped hard and bare around it. On this side stood a cleared patch of corn. I declare I never saw such poor and scrubby corn, Jenny said, but maybe they could tell us how to go. As they came abreast of the cabin, a pack of dogs rushed out. Sayward picked up a stout club, and they stayed their distance, barking and carrying on. A dark-faced boy about 16 came hollering at them with strange words. When he saw the 4 strangers in the road, he stopped. Jenny called shrilly above the hullabaloo, "Can you tell us how to get to the Harris place?" The boy stood stock still, never saying back a word. After a little he turned and went into the cabin. "He don't know nothing, he's Injun," Jenny said. They had started on when a man, still older than Sayward, came out. He was dressed in pants and shirt, but was plainly an Indian. He moved stiffly, very straight, and with great deliberation. He spoke in the same language as the boy to the dogs, and when one wouldn't obey him, He picked it up and threw it with such force against a tree that it ran yelping pitifully into the cabin. As he came toward them, Sayward felt the children move behind her. "We are looking for the Harris place," she told him. "Him live here," the Indian said. "My name Harris." There was dead silence for a moment. "It must be some mistake," Jenny put in lordly. "We are looking for Miss Solly Harris." "Him my woman," he said. Sayward saw Jenny draw back, as if he had hit her. She felt Massey and Chauncey push up against her and freeze. She waited a little, gathering her thought, setting her face. "Can we see her?" she asked friendly. "Sure, him in house." He made no move to take them in, only stood there with all the time and indifference in the world. Sayward started toward the cabin. "Sayrd," Jenny begged, holding fast to her arm. "This can't be our Sully." "That's what I want to find out," Sayward declared. She had come this far. Nothing was going to stop her now. "If it was Sully, she'd be out," Jenny stammered. "She'd hear us. She'd come to the door." "She might want to fix up a little first," Sayward said. But when she got to the door, she found no sign that anyone had tried to red up the cabin. The door stood wide open. Inside were neither chairs, table, nor stools. A younger Indian woman with 3 small children sat on the hard earth floor. A younger Indian man and the boy stood on the other side. At the fire, with her back toward them, bent an older woman. She was cooking something in a pot. She wore a shapeless gray cabin gown, was barefoot, her feet and legs brown. Her back remained toward the door, as if she were deaf, and yet something passed over Sayward when she saw her. With the dogs baring their teeth and snarling at her, Sayward stepped unbidden into the cabin. "We are looking for Miss Solly Harris," she said. The older woman made no movement. Not till one of the younger Indians said something to her in the Delaware language did she turn around, and then aversely. Her face was brown as her feet, wrinkled, the face of an older squaw, and yet Sayward saw something in it of her own Grandmam Pally she had seen as a girl back along the Conestoga in Pennsylvania. It shook her to her bones. "Sully," she said, starting toward her, but such a hard, implacable look came into the woman's black Indian eyes that it stopped her. "Wasn't your name Sully Luckett when you were a young one?" Sayward stammered. "My name's Sully Harris," she answered, without feeling. "But when you were a little tyke, didn't you have a family by the name of Luckett? Back in Pennsylvania. Then you all went to Northwest Territory. Didn't you go out with the cows and get lost in the woods and never lay eyes on your folks again? No, remember." "Try to recollect," Sayward begged her. "Can't you mind your mam and pap? He was out here to see you not so long ago. Worth, his name was. Don't you mind your brother Wyatt and your sisters Asha, Jenny, and Sayrd, that used to live with you in that cabin? Well, if you do, I'm your sister Sayrd, and out there's Jenny. Don't you mind us now?" "No, me Indian," she said stolidly. She was lying, Sayward told herself. Jenny and the younger ones were watching from the door. Massey and Chauncey turned piteous faces toward her. "Mama, let's go," Massey whispered. "Jenny, maybe you'd sing something for her," Sayward asked. "Something she used to know, like Fly Up. It might help her remember." Jenny looked shocked. Her face said she couldn't do that. Not here in front of Indians. Yet never had she refused Sayward anything, and in the end she gave in. She started very low, not even clearing her throat. It seemed at first she was only going to hum. Then the song came out as of itself, like spring water rises from the ground. So clear and strong it sounded at last that it gave Sayward a turn to hear it. Haycocks in the meter, cherries in the dish, red bird fly up, give me my wish, chestnuts in the treetop, pumpkin in the dish. Brown bird fly up, give me my wish, ice in the river, possum in the dish, snowbird fly up, give me my wish, violets in the holler, poke greens in the dish, bluebird fly up, give me my wish. How many times, Sayward thought, had they heard that in the old days? Till Jenny was halfways through, it seemed like they were back in the woods with their mam still living, and Asha and Wyatt still at home. It was almost like this was her pap's cabin, and Sully was a little tyke, still there with them. But when the song stopped and the spell broke, Sully Harris's eyes looked back at her with the stoic restlessness of the savage, as when you and he stare at each other across the uncrossable gulf. "It's not her," Jenny said, very low, or she'd say something. Oh, what, Sayward thought, could Jenny expect Sully Harris to say? How did she reckon her sister felt, standing there in her bare feet and ragged dress, in her dirty Indian cabin, with her dark Indian children and grandchildren around her? Did Jenny expect Sully to thank her white sisters for coming to see her in their soft leather shoes and fine dresses, with elegant mitts on their hands, and bonnets with silken ribbons on their heads, with their own clean white children along, and their white husbands at home? What was the story Pap used to tell of Janny Gossett, who the Shawanese took from Buffalo Valley? Years later, when her folks found her, she had an Indian family, and even though her Shawnee man was dead, she wouldn't go back. She would be a disgrace to her white people, she said. Her old-time friends and relations would look down on her and her Indian young ones. No, it was too late now. Never could she go back, and never could Sully. They had taken up the Indian life, and that's the life they had to live till they died. Sayward couldn't look at Sully now without her heart yearning toward her till she could hardly stand it. Gladly would she have done most anything to make it right, but what could she do? Is this what they had come all the long way from Ohio for? Is this what brave young hopes and spunkiness like Sully's came to in the end? How far off that little tyke she used to know seemed now, lost and alone in the woods. She had played cabin to remind her of her brother and sisters, but now that the two of her sisters were here, she wouldn't give in that she knew them. One time she must have cried bitterly for them, but now she wished them far off, and the biggest favor they could do her was not to claim any more that they were her sisters. Sully Harris stared back at her without winking. After a while she spoke in Delaware to the young Indian, who was likely her boy. "She say," he translated to Sayward, "you and her go, but leave young ones. Wait by road, by and by come out." Jenny looked alarmed, and Chauncey and Massey begged their mother not to leave them, but she cut them short. They could do that much for their Aunt Sully. She saw them wince at the word. Sayward herself spoke to Sully Harris before she went, taking the cold, impassive hand in both of hers. "I hope this won't be the last time I see you, Sully. If you ever need anything, let me know. I'll send it to you if I can. You got my address. If you ever get that way, stop and visit me." But although Indians loved to visit, she felt that her sister Sully never would. As they left, Sully Harris spoke deep in her throat to the rest of her family. The latter followed them out reluctantly, leaving her alone inside with the white young ones. Sayward reckoned she would not soon forget Chauncey's frightened face at the door when she went. The Indians moved off by themselves to the other side of the cabin. The older Indian man she could see down along the river. She and Jenny went to the road. "Not a foot farther will I budge," Jenny said, "till Massey and Chauncey come out." It seemed a mighty long time until they came running like deer from the cabin. Chauncey looked pale, and Massey was crying. "What did she do to you?" Jenny wanted to know right away. "She didn't do anything. She just stayed in there with us." After a while she took Chauncey's hand and stroked it. She said how he minded her of somebody. Sayward and Jenny looked at each other. "Wyatt," they said together. "She didn't say Uncle Wyatt or any name," Massey said. She just stroked Chauncey's hand and said how white it was. And then she started to cry. It looked so terrible when she cried. I had to cry too. And then what? She stopped and asked what I was crying for. She threw Chauncey's hand down. She said white was a very bad color. She said white men were good in church, but bad in the woods. They killed and cheated the Indians, she said, but her man was always good and kind, she said. We should tell you he was always good and kind to her. He was a great soldier and killed lots of white men in battle. One time he scalped so many white men, his arm got tired. He was brave and not afraid to do what was right. More than once he burned white men at a fire he made himself. Jenny drew an expressive face to Sayward. What else did she say? That's all. But you were in such a long time. She just stood most of the time looking at us. I couldn't tell if she hated us or liked us. Then she gave us each something and said we could go. Massey opened her hand and showed a silver shilling. She had them in a little leather bag under her dress. I saw her reach in, and her skin in there was as white as mine is, Mama. Sayward stood there, her face working. Jenny put her handkerchief away. I'm going back and talk to her and try to do something for her, she announced. I wouldn't if I was you, Jenny, Sayward said gravely. You know what Pap used to say, that a white person never does the Indians any good. He always tries to make a white person out of them. Pap said he never knew a single Indian who made a good white person, though he knew plenty whites who made good Indians. Well, I don't believe it that strong, Jenny said. I feel terribly sorry for her if you don't. I didn't think it was really her when we were in there with her. Now I'm going back and talk to her and see what I can do. Anyway, I can give her goodbye when I leave and tell her I hope we'll meet in heaven. Sayward and the children waited. Jenny was white as a sheet when she returned. She wouldn't talk about it until they were some distance back to town. She acted queer again like she was at first. She said grimly she wouldn't even talk till I made her. Then she said right out she didn't know us, said her name never was Luckett, claimed she never seen us before. I tried to talk to her like a sister, and she told me to clear out or she'd sick the dogs on us. Sayward said nothing. Her face felt weary and benumbed. She should never have let Jenny go back. How she hated now, turning away from her own flesh and blood sister, leaving her behind in that poor cabin while she set out for another state and a mansion house. She tried to tell herself it wasn't so bad as she and Jenny felt. She reminded herself of what Pap used to say, that white folks like to think their life the only way, and that any savage ought to jump at the chance to be a white person. But he used to tell them none of those white prisoners his old colonel took from the Indians ever thanked him for giving them back to their white folks. Most of them, he said, fought like cats and dogs to stay with their Indian step-mammies and pappies. Even when they got home, some ran off to lead the Indian life again. That was the way to look at it, Sayward told herself. Sully might have had a hard life, but it was better than if she had died that time in the woods and been put underground. She had grown up and tasted life. She knew what it meant to give birth to young ones, to nurse and watch them growing. She had a cabin, a man, and family of her own. It mightn't look like much of a life to white folks, but you had to take life as it was, and not as you wished you had it. Just the same, all the way to the canal and to Ohio, on the boat, something kept coming back to Sayward's mind. Grandmam McWhirter, long dead and buried, had said it, the time that poor little Sully was lost. Sometimes it's a good thing if you don't find a lost young'un, she had said. I'd as soon see them dead and buried.